Welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset. Today we get to talk with Dr. David Schein, who lives in Houston. And Dr. Schein, or David as he likes to sometimes be called, is the Endowed Chair of the Cameron School of Business at the University of St. Thomas. And we'll get into all of that and lots of other stuff. But David, I'm going to go ahead and call you David, if that's okay. Welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the invitation. And, we had an opportunity for a pre-interview recently, and I'm fascinated by your background and your accomplishments. So it's fun to be back with you.
So do you do a podcast?
Yes, I actually do two series right now. The main one is called Saving America, and we're in our fourth season of that. And it's called The Intersection of Business and Politics. And then the other series, which is more recent, is called Business Law 101. And as I teach business law to college seniors, we've selected different lectures and clipped them into just 3 to 5 minute portions. And we're now adding new sections of current business news events that have a legal aspect. So it keeps me pretty busy.
Well, if you ever need a guest, if you think we're a fit after all of this, would love to explore it.
That'd be great, certainly.
And certainly anyone who is listening to this, by the end, we will go through how you can reach out to David, and you might be a guest on his podcast as well, or certainly learn more about what he has to offer. But we'll get there. So you said in our earlier discussions that you grew up in a large family. I'd love to learn about that.
Sure.
I only had one brother, so and of course 2 parents, but only one brother. So we didn't have the luxury or challenges or joy of a large family.
Well, it is a two-bladed sword. I'm the oldest of 7 children. My dad was a career enlisted member of the U.S. Navy, and especially in the time period, I don't think they're well paid today, but certainly when he was doing his career in the military from shortly after World War II until around 1980, the pay was not good, and he had to, struggle financially to keep food on the table and keep a roof over our heads. And my mom, because of the 7 children, really couldn't work outside the home because she had quite a bit to take care of at the house. We all had family responsibilities. The boys, we were very traditional background. The 3 boys, we were responsible for yard maintenance and taking the trash out and stuff. And the girls helped my mom in the kitchen and with laundry and things like that. So we all had our own responsibilities and basically clean up your own stuff. But it was a bit of a challenge. At the same time, it's funny because of what you just said about having one brother, because you get used to kind of it's more of a crew and approach than an individualistic approach, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I do understand what you're saying. So what did your dad do?
He was a chief yeoman he retired as a chief yeoman in the U.S. Navy. He did 28 and a half years in the Navy. He actually was afforded an opportunity. The crossover degree or enlisted level is called an ensign. An ensign is a crossover from enlisted to officer, but he felt that at the time they offered that to him, that the cost of uniforms to go to officer uniforms and so forth would put too much of a financial crimp in the family. So he actually careered out as the senior enlisted officer, which is a chief in the Navy, sergeant in the Army.
Interesting. So the military didn't pay for the uniforms and all that?
Apparently, they give you an allowance, but like in a lot of things, it's not enough to actually cover a complete redo. And my dad was a very modest fellow, and I think he also felt socially pressured because he had not yet finished college. And generally speaking, in the military, the standard pretty much post-World War II is that you finish college and you can start as a junior lieutenant or junior officer, but then you can move up from there. So since he didn't have a college degree at the time, I think that was another factor.
A factor that kind of limited what he was able to get.
Right, or that he was willing to take on because he would have been dealing primarily with other officers who did have a college degree already.
So when did he actually term out in the military then?
I'm looking back, I said 1980. Actually, I think it was around 1974. And so he actually was in the military through the Vietnam War.
Uh-huh.
And at one point, he did have orders to go to Vietnam, which for a Navy cabin person, if you will, yeoman manages the business of the ship. That's a relatively safe position, but he would have been sitting on a ship outside of Tonkin Harbor rather than being on land or flying planes over North Vietnam, which was, of course, as you know from John McCain's story, a much more dangerous activity. But because he had so many children, there was some intercession there, and he was moved to a 3-year position at Norfolk, Virginia, which in turn ended up my strong connection to the state of Virginia. You know, Norfolk is Navy Town, USA.
Right. So you grew up more than in Virginia than anywhere else?
Well, I went to the school that I went to was divided in a very neat fashion. It had the school system in Norfolk, Virginia, which, by the way, was a fully integrated system, which I thought was very beneficial. I went from a high school in Massachusetts with a total of 12 Black students in the whole school in small town in suburban Boston to a high school, a large high school that was 1/3 Black. And so it was my first experience dealing with a much more diverse student population. And in fact, when I was in high school, this was still a transition period in the late 60s where we were one of the first integrated high school debate teams. I know it seems strange today, but the people around us were not used to seeing Black and white students on the same high school debate team. And we had some interesting experiences because of that. But it was a great experience for me to go to a different state. But because it was a senior high school system, when I moved there starting my sophomore year in high school, all of the other students were starting there at the same time. So whereas many military families, you would just get dropped in at whatever day or semester that your father or mother ended up being transferred, you were kind of at the mercy of what was happening. But that did help me a great deal to be on the same level as the other students. In other words, we all were starting in a new school in our sophomore year. And it was quite a big high school. The whole school had 2,700 students for just 3 grades. And my graduating class had over 700 students.
What school was it again?
It was called Norview Senior High, and the Norfolk has gone back to the traditional system where the middle schools are 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and the high schools are the traditional 4-year high school. And but at the time it was called Norview Senior High, and it was one of the 4 high schools in Norfolk, and they expanded to 5 high schools. While I was in high school, I was fortunate enough to stay with Norview. But it was a very interesting experience because we were living in government housing, which was when you're in the military, especially as an enlisted man, living in government housing is a better deal because the token cost of your housing it cannot be replaced in the civilian marketplace. But it was very interesting because I was one of the first honors graduates that the high school ever had who was living in the housing project that was served by that high school. And then my sister did it the year behind us. So we kind of turned things around a little bit. I came in second in my high school graduating class My sister graduated a year behind me and was first in her class. So I think we redefined what it was like to have students coming out of a government housing project.
Must have been a little bit of a challenge having 7 kids and dealing with school and so on. Did you guys help each other a lot?
We had a
good team network.
Yeah, we had a particular system. Like I said, we all had family responsibilities, chores to do. So what it looked like is the family would retire to the living room and watch the little black and white TV that they had at the time. And my sister Catherine and I, who were the 2 oldest, would stay at the kitchen table and do homework until, from say, dinner time until 10, sometimes later at night. And we did that every night pretty much during the school year. So my parents understood the need for us to do that. And the funny part was my mom had a GED, my dad was a high school graduate. My parents had no concept of what it was like to actually go to college, but they kept telling us, you will go to college, you will go to college, you'll go to college. And it's like, once I got to college, it was like, I don't think my parents really quite had a clue, but, and I didn't take any money from my parents once I left for college. And then my sister, a year later, also did not take any money when she left for college. So it was, an unusual thing. And I find it interesting today that the federal government is talking about dismissing student loans. And, all I can say is I don't know if my sister borrowed very much money at all, but I borrowed a modest amount of money, federally guaranteed loans, and I paid all of them back once I got out of school. And I think that's the appropriate thing to do because you're making an investment in your own future.
It is a lot more expensive to do college now. I know when I went to University of California, Irvine, so it's the state university system, I think it was like $273 a quarter for registration and so on. And I know living in the dorm, it was, I think if I recall right, I'm trying to remember, it was not grossly expensive. It was like $1,200 to live in the dorm. And, it's of course a lot different nowadays.
Yes, it is. And there's no question about it. I just had my younger son finished college in 2018, and he attended actually a branch of Texas A&M University, a state university here in Texas. And it was the cost of education was not trivial.
No.
But he did very well. He did very well when he's finished school. And actually, I think he makes about what I make, and he's working half as much. So I think he had a good investment. And and one of the things that statistically they look at on these student loans is the 2 schools that have the largest student debt are law school and medical school. Yeah. Now, in fairness, law school is not a guaranteed payout. A lot of people think it is, but speaking as a law graduate, you have to get out there and get your job done and work hard. And especially if you hang out your shingle, it's certainly not a guaranteed paycheck. But for medical school, there's such an enormous demand for medical doctors that the normal payout is $10,000 to $20,000 a month as soon as they get their medical license. So in that ballpark, I'm not sure why we would forgive student loans for those people unless they go to low income communities and do things like that. And then parallel to that is the students who pursue education to go to work in urban school districts also get a certain balance. I think students with disabilities also can apply for student loan relief. So I favor more targeted programs than just blanket, just saying, oh, we'll just write off all the student debt. I don't think that's I don't think it serves a social interest, in other words.
So you left high school and went to college, and you also, as I recall, started a radio show and eventually started your own business.
Yes.
Clearly, you're doing a lot of innovative things, and your family taught you well how to think and how to move forward. And of course, the terminology we use is be unstoppable. But tell us about college and your business and the radio show, if you will.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I started. I've been a writer since I was fairly young. I went to K through 12, K through 8 rather, in the Catholic school system, and that's back then especially, it was a very good school system with the nuns who really focused on the 3 R's, and especially writing. And I'm not saying every one of us can write, but certainly it inspired me to write, and I was a very avid reader. And so when I was in high school, I was quite capable of writing papers. I used to type papers for other students and things like that. And so when I got to college, I started with the student newspaper. And the thing I ran into is they kept editing and changing my articles. I got a little upset with that after a while when they would take an article I'd spent a lot of time writing and cut it in half, and not very creative editing either. It didn't come out very good. So I had an opportunity to move into radio, went and got my license, and initially just was being a college radio station DJ. A bit of trivia: WXPN, which is the FM radio station at the Penn campus, was started by none other than Hal Prince, the famous Broadway producer who just recently passed away.
Yes.
And while I was doing the entertainment radio, which is what I morphed into, I actually had the opportunity to interview him several times, and he was very gracious and cordial to allow a college student to interview him. I think he did that also because we were at the XPN station initially. And so I morphed into doing a entertainment radio show from 7 to 8 p.m. on a Thursday night. And about a year into that, the WHYY, which is the public radio station for the greater Philadelphia area, approached me and said, "Dave, how would you feel about moving your radio program, which was called the Arts Menagerie? How would you feel about moving that over to HYY?" And the advantage for me is that while WXPN had a very good broadcast area, in fact, the two radio stations ironically had about the same power and about the same geographic coverage, the being affiliated with HYY gave me a much broader access to traditional press outlets. Like I got invited to press luncheons, things that involved the entertainment community, and it just gave me a foot in the door. So it was a very exciting time period for me. I covered all sorts of things, and the show was recorded in the early evening and then broadcast from 10 to 11 p.m. on the East Coast. And I would cover stage plays, fine art exhibits, and would include interviews with different people that were touring. And I also provided reviews of different stage plays and art shows. So it certainly opened a lot of doors for me. And of course, an experience like that is a very maturing experience. I did not ever look at it as a business, but the business came about because of kind of an odd situation. I am one of those stone sober people, and I've never done drugs. I don't really understand why you would want to do drugs. And I was doing this at a time which I colloquially refer to as sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the summer before I started college was Woodstock, which famously was quite a celebration of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so it was kind of the Woodstock generation. But what I ran into was just a very, very just oddball situation. So there was an art gallery called The Painted Bride, on South Street in Philadelphia. And South Street had been where all the bridal galleries were affiliated and were associated. There was a neighborhood of art galleries, and it was kind of a neat area. And by 1970, South Street was a ruin. All the businesses had closed, and there was a lot of crime and everything. So these fellows got together, these artists and art appreciator people, started an art gallery called the Painted Bride. And what they did was they would have live entertainment on Friday and Saturday night to help out local artists, folk singers and similar performers. So they somehow connected with me, and I began to cover events at the Painted Bride. And what happened during that time period is South Street blossomed into an arts district. And it became very popular and very trendy, and they had some high-end restaurants open on South Street and other art galleries and nice bakeries, and all sorts of things happened during the several-year period that we're talking about. But in any event, I'm over at the Painted Bride and talking to some of the folk singers, and we actually had some of the folk singers come on my radio program and perform live. And, just with a guitar, they would just show up, and, we didn't do any special miking or anything. We just sit them back from the mic a little bit. So we got to do some pretty interesting stuff. But what happened was several of the folk singers approached me and they said, "You don't do drugs, do you?" And I know that sounds like a funny question, but what was happening at the time is that the traditional model is you have a manager if you're a performer. Most performers do not have business backgrounds. There's a few out there who do, but most do not. And so what would happen is that the manager would get paid for the evening, and we're not talking about a lot of money. It might have been $60. It might have been $100 would be a nice night for a folk singer back in 1970. But if the manager was on drugs, the performer might only get 20 out of the $100 or might get nothing. And so they became very concerned because they needed management help, but they didn't want some drug addict taking the bulk of the money or taking most of the money after all they had done the work. And so I began to slowly represent some folk singers. And once the word got out, it was all word of mouth. This is, of course, before the internet, and I didn't have the money to buy any advertising or anything. And so we created an acronym. So the Arts Menagerie is TAM. So we called the business operation TAM Productions. And I had an artist who worked with me, a wonderful artist named Al Walker, who sadly passed away about 4 years ago. And Al did some wonderful artwork, created logos and letterhead and things like that. And I would get on the phone and call various colleges mostly, but also clubs, and book the folk singers. And then it morphed into, I added rock bands, and I had some fine arts, and I put on some art shows to display the artists who created artwork. So it was a lot of fun. And I was able to break even. I didn't make any enormous amount of money out of it. If you can think about it, somebody's performing for $60 or $100, the management commission is between $6 and $10. So you have to have a lot of $10 commissions to, kind of pay the rent. Rent wasn't bad. I remember the rent was around $110 or $115 a month.
Did you manage anyone who we might know?
Well, unfortunately not. What happened is I was accepted to a full-time MBA program at the University of Virginia when I came out of my undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania. And so because of the pressures of that, and leaving Philadelphia, where the artists all were local in the Philadelphia area, I turned over the business to a young fellow who had already started an agency, and he absorbed my people. And unfortunately, and again, pre-email, I think the current generation forgets how much more work it was when you didn't have mobile phones and you didn't have email to stay in touch with people. And of course, I was, working very hard at grad school, but I did unfortunately lose contact. I do know that one of my very first performers that I worked with, did release a children's recording around 2005 or 2006. I found that on the internet. But I wasn't able to find any of the other performers. I did have the opportunity as a member of the press to meet a number of very famous people, including Carol Channing, Helen Hayes, Edward Mulhare, quite a list of people. Probably one of the most fun luncheons I had was the rock promoter Bill Graham. And Bill Graham came to Philadelphia as part of a tour. What had happened is that rock had exploded during the several-year period that we're talking about in the early 1970s.
Right.
And it went from small venues like the Fillmores, Fillmore East and Fillmore West, into big stadiums that could absorb the sound from the Who and these other big groups. And so Graham did a very intelligent thing. He did a big concert promotion run at the very end and then closed the two playhouses. And he released a triple album of the closing of the Fillmore. And so what happened was that when he was promoting that, I had an opportunity to have lunch with him. And of course, unfortunately, several years later, he died in a helicopter crash. But it was very interesting to get a chance to talk with him close up.
I remember being at UC Irvine one Sunday, and we learned that there was a symposium on the presidency, and one of the speakers was going to be Hubert Humphrey. So this was after he was vice president.
Yes.
And we have this little college radio station, but we decided that we were going to interview him. There were a few of us. So we went over, we learned where they were going to park his limo, and then he would walk to the gymnasium to do the presentation. And we intercepted the car, and as he got out, we said, "Mr. Vice President, could we interview you?" And he was very gracious. He said, "After my presentation, I'll be glad to talk with you boys." And sure enough, after the meeting was over, the symposium was over, there were other people at it. Gallup from Gallup Polling Organization, I remember, even asked him a question. We were pretty impressed by Gallup being there. But anyway, Humphrey did his session and came back out, and they were trying to hustle him right back into the car. And he said, "No, I promised these boys an interview, and we're going to do it." And he did, which was a lot of fun.
It's interesting you mentioned Hubert Humphrey. We talked a little bit about my high school days, and in order to get a full scholarship to an Ivy League college, I worked pretty hard in high school. And one of the things that happened while I was in high school is the beginning of the fall semester of my senior year, I was invited to the National Citizenship Conference, which was held in Washington, D.C. And I got to stay at the Mayflower Hotel, and just all sorts of exciting things happened. And one of the things I did while I was there is I went to the Hubert Humphrey for President headquarters.
There you go.
And I actually have a full color poster of Hubert Humphrey for President. And I've never displayed it. I did display it in my dorm room briefly, so it's got a few pinholes in the corners, but I have it in storage at this time, and I will probably put that up at eBay at some point. And it should be a kind of a fun item, but it's an authentic. I can vouch for it because I personally picked it up in September 1968 from the Hubert Humphrey for President headquarters, but it was very interesting. I think I have a few other bits and pieces from my visit to their political office there. So, and I've been, following politics for, very long time. And so in addition to my interest in business is my interest in politics.
So you went on to Virginia after undergraduate school, right?
Correct. Yeah. UVA at that time had a kind of a takeoff on the Harvard program. It was a 2-year case method program. And most of the professors at the Virginia Darden School, Colgate Darden School of Business, had attended Harvard and done their Doctor of Business Administration DBA program. And so it was a heavily case method program, which is the way the Harvard system was styled. And because of Charlottesville being Charlottesville, especially back then, today it's a hotbed of startups, but back then it was kind of a sleepy town that just happened to be hosting a top-notch business school. And while I was in their 2-year program, which is a very intense program, the school moved into the top 20, and I think it's been in the top 20 business schools since then.
So you eventually went to the Wharton Graduate School?
Well, while I was an undergraduate at Penn, I took about a year's worth of credit at the Wharton Graduate Division. And that was a very interesting experience. At that time, I don't know how Penn is structured today, but at that time, there was no barricade between taking undergraduate and graduate courses. And so I took a full year's equivalent at Wharton Graduate. And as I finished, the people at Wharton Graduate knew me because they started the first entrepreneurship center in the United States, Collegiate Entrepreneurship Center. And the person who started that center loved to interview the young David Schein. Because I was out there doing it, running it out of the second bedroom in my little apartment. And they got kind of a kick out of it. And they would periodically, when I would blow through their building, they'd say, hey, let's talk to you for a few minutes. What's the latest? And kind of the things that you and I just talked about, they would talk to me about it as they got it started. And to give you an idea, recently, UPenn opened an entire building dedicated to that entrepreneurship center. So that center has been very successful. But what happened is the Wharton graduate people said, look, and they were blunt. They said, look, Schein, we know you too well. We don't want you to just stay here and get an MBA. Go someplace else. And I was very ambitious and wanted to get my credentials. And the Darden School at Virginia was a similar program. They really wanted people who had been out working for, 2 or 3 years and then come back for their doctorate or a master's degree rather. But in my case, they allowed me to come in directly from college because I did have the radio show and I did have the business experience of having my own business. Now, if I had it to do over again, I should have gone out and worked, as we say, worked corporate for a couple of years and gotten a little bit more background before I got my MBA. But, that's old news at this point. And in fact, I went directly from the Darden program to law school. And my connection to Houston was I had family here in Houston and they said, hey, we heard you're thinking of going to law school. Why don't you come down here and check out the University of Houston? So that was how I ended up at Houston.
What caused you, though, to get a doctorate of jurisprudence or go into law, even though you had clearly been kind of going in another direction?
Well, a couple of things. I found that there were hitches. And frankly, I tried to get some legal help for like drafting contracts for my performers and things like that. And the attorneys that I worked with, I'll be very blunt, were sloppy. They didn't take, a young guy who was still in college seriously. They didn't give us the quick turnaround that we needed with contracts and things like that. And so I said, I want to make sure that I'm a different kind of attorney, a business attorney who really, gets stuff out the door quickly. And so that was one factor. The other factor is at that time, a number of major corporation presidents were also law graduates. So there were people who either had an MBA and a law degree or just a law degree and had been moved into the corner office. So I saw it as a win-win move to go to law school. If I had that to do over again, I would probably, law school is interesting because for most people, it's a 3-year full-time gig or a 4-year part-time gig. And I would probably have taken some of the very generous offers I had finishing the MBA program and gone to law school at night on the 4-year cycle. So again, there's a lot of options that you come across on the road there, but I did do college, the MBA and the law degree back to back to back, and all of them full time. I did finish law school a semester early, so that helped me a little bit.
Something that I'm curious about, you have clearly, so far we're talking all about your education, but you've done some pretty well-rounded things. You've gotten an MBA, you went and got a law degree and so on. How did your upbringing and your family life kind of shape you to have that kind of mental attitude about going after education and just being really a survivor in what you did in college and then later?
Well, my parents worked very hard. Like I said, my mom did a little bit of gig work outside the house from time to time, but generally was a full-time homemaker. And I can tell you, when you're raising 7 kids and you're doing a great job, which she did a phenomenal job. That's dedication. That's hard work. You get up early and you work hard all day. My dad, at the same time, had a successful military career. And he often worked a second job, especially when I would have been in middle school before we moved to Norfolk, Virginia. He worked seasonal work in the evenings that would accommodate his military schedule when he was on shore duty. The way the Navy works, you're on a ship for 2 years and then you're on shore duty for 2 years, and they rotate that. And so when he was on his shore duty schedule, he would work a second job to make some additional money and help, keep the bills paid. So having seen my parents work that hard certainly set a good example for us. The other thing, as I mentioned, is my parents were pretty tough on us in terms of, you will go to college, you will study hard, you will go to college. So my parents, paid attention to that and imbued us with this overall drive. My dad's family had a business interest. And so my father's father was a mom and pop grocer in this small town in Massachusetts before the A&P opened, the first major supermarket chain, opened one of their locations in Taunton. Again, Taunton's a small town between Boston and Providence, and over on the eastern part of Massachusetts. But it was kind of interesting because that's a tough business. And Joe Schein, my father's father, ran that grocery store during the Great Depression, when people were, they were giving food away up the street to people who weren't working. And here he was selling food. So he was a very creative person. And so, there's kind of a bloodline there.
What did you do after you got your law degree?
Well, being here in Houston, Texas, it was pretty straightforward. While I was in law school, second half of law school, I worked for Gulf Oil part-time, on an hourly basis, working with natural gas contracts. When I finished law school, I got a minor offer from Gulf that I turned down, another offer from another oil company, and I turned that down. And then I hit the right one. I was given a job offer by Shell Oil Company. And I then had a nice brief career with Shell Oil. I worked for Shell 3 states in 3 years. I had 2 promotions in that time period. And it was a tremendous place to work. The people say, well, Dave, it was such a great place to work. Why'd you leave? Well, I left to be a manager at a mid-sized oil company. And part of the problem with a Shell Oil is it's such a big organization that if you're very ambitious, the opportunity to move up tends to be a little slower just because there's so much competition. There's so many people between you and the next rung up the ladder. So I did have a great deal more physical freedom and opportunity to do more things with a smaller oil company. But I went with another oil company. And so my total corporate employment was about 10 years. And at that point, I hung out my shingle. And so I did private practice for about a dozen years after that.
You couldn't convince them to change the name of the company from Shell Oil to Shine Oil, huh?
Well, I'll tell you, they after I left Shell, they at some point Shell did start a new ventures division, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And I actually knew some people who worked in the Shell Ventures operation, and I think if they'd had that when I was still there and had an opportunity to go over there, that might have been a pretty interesting thing, because basically Shell would let some of their executives work on some of these startup company ideas, and I think that was a pretty creative approach. Shell also went through some major changes. It used to be there was Shell USA and Shell Dutch Shell, the parent company, and then they kind of liquidated Shell USA and created like Shell Global or something like that. So the company did go through some changes, but that was after I had left and gone to the Tenneco Oil Company. Tenneco Oil Company was one of the big conglomerates at the time when conglomerates were sexy. Of course, ITT was the most famous one, Harold Janine, but Tenneco was a very successful, though primarily the money originally came from the oil and gas industry following World War II. But unfortunately, while I was there, the company kind of self-destructed. And one of the reasons why I decided to set out in private practice was I could see that the Tenneco was on the way out as an organization, and I felt it's better to get out there and do my thing. And that was a very interesting and enjoyable period. And, you know, as I tell people, I left corporate and went out, hung out my shingle, and I did that and never missed a mortgage payment. But again, similar to starting my business in college, it was certainly not an easy path.
Mm-hmm. What did you do? What kind of law did you practice once you went out on your own?
I have always been a small business representative, and my main focus is employment law. So I do a lot of business contracts, and I do lots of employment law. When I was corporate, that was my responsibility. I was a human resource representative. I worked in industrial relations, which is working with unions when I was at Shell Oil. And then when I went to Tenneco, I worked with unions, and I also did a lot of retail employment law. Tenneco at the time was operating about 500 large self-service gas stations in the South and the Southeast. And I handled about 1,500 EEOC complaints over a 5-year period. That's a pretty good volume.
Well, somewhere along the line, you got involved in some way or another in equal employment and disability law and so on, I gather.
That is correct. When I was at Tenneco, I got involved with the Texas Commission on Employment of the Handicapped, which of course we use the term disabled today, but Texas was actually ahead of the feds because this was in the 80s. The Texas law related back to the 70s. And so I did have an opportunity to work with a fellow named Bill Hale, who headed up that commission for the state of Texas, and was also kind of on the ground floor when President Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, and then that was phased into effect between 90 and 94. So I was one of the early people to understand it because it had a lot of the features that the state law had. And, I'm a very active advocate for employment of the disabled. As recently as yesterday, when I was teaching business law, I was talking with my students about the importance of consideration of how reasonable accommodation works under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how the important thing is to take a look at people for what they can do, not what they can't do.
Yeah, and of course today we wouldn't probably even call it the Commission for the Disabled, but rather Commission for Persons with Disabilities, because
correct,
we really the words do matter. And
yes,
saying I'm disabled because I happen to be blind should really be no different than saying you're disabled because you happen to be able to see, and without lights, you don't have a lick of probability of being able to travel around. But, we we all have our challenges, and we also all have our gifts. So I appreciate persons with disabilities as opposed to other things. I had a discussion with someone this morning who was talking about the fact that I'm visually impaired, and I said, I don't think so. Again, words matter, because I said, why do you say I'm visually impaired? Do I look different simply because I'm blind? Does my whole appearance change visually because I'm blind? Now, I don't like vision impaired because I think I have lots of vision, and as I love to tell people, I just don't see so good. But eyesight and vision are enough synonymous that vision impaired is something I could tolerate, although I think that either I'm sight impaired or you're blind impaired, and one way or the other we work that out. But disability is a term that has to become different than what people have believed and decided that it is, because the reality is having a so-called disability has taught me that everyone has a disability, and why should I be different than anyone else just because I'm in a minority? And of course, that's the real problem, right? I happen to be in a minority, and the result is that people who are not tend to think, because we're taught that way, that we're better.
Well, I think obviously, Mike, you made some very, very good points there. And as a person who does management training for EEO sensitivity and things like that, I emphasize the fact that there's so many opportunities in life. And it's interesting what you say. I have very good daytime vision, but I have large eyes. I didn't really realize they don't look that big to me, but I have large pupils, which means that in light, I have to protect my eyes from too much light. And in the dark, I have extreme trouble seeing in the dark. So I'm one of those people that when I walk into a room late in the afternoon or in the evening, the first thing I do is run for lights and turn all the lights on because that way I don't trip and fall over something. And I actually clear paths so that I'm able to function if I don't turn the lights on and I decide to get up before daylight or something like that. So yeah, all of us have to make adjustments for whatever is unique about us. And probably a better word is saying, what are your unique qualities and qualifications versus saying, what are your disabilities?
And I think that's an absolutely valid point, and one I wish more people would recognize. How do you think the Americans with Disabilities Act, looking back on it now, because it's been 31 years since it was signed.
Yes.
How do you feel that it has really changed, well, our whole outlook on people with minorities such as I have, or have we really mentally changed all that much?
I don't think we've changed. First of all, I think the act has helped. That's number one. I think it's a positive in itself. I think there's a couple major issues with it. One of them is that my experience, which is extensive, I've handled over 2,000 EEOC complaints at this point. Again, a very high volume when I was working with retail gasoline stations. Is that the least competent federal agency I've dealt with, which is really saying something when you consider how incompetent so many of the federal agencies are, is the EEOC. And my experience with them has been that they're not serving the public interest, sadly, and they're not well run, and they don't train their people well. And I think if you're going to have a division that helps people with discrimination, that it ought to be a lot more effective, that it should be, number one, focused on education before everything else. And I don't see them doing much of that. Number two, what's happening throughout the United States with the EEOC is they are flooded with complaints. They are flooded. And what the EEOC needs to do is they need to put a tough person in charge at each office who tells people to get a life and show up for work and do your damn job and pick out the cases that require attention, that really should have attention, because by trying to take every case that comes in the door, they end up not giving good service to the people who are legitimately discriminated against, which is a fairly small percentage of the population, by the way, and they're not getting anybody's job done. So I'd like to see them run a lot better than they are. And I don't have a magic wand for that, but that's part of what I'm seeing, again, as somebody who's had a lot of work with the EOC. But in terms of education, I think that we have done a better job of sensitizing our population, particularly our younger population, to the realities of we're all different. And I think part of making people more sensitive to what color people are, protection of LGBT and things like that, that if, as developing a more accepting population and frankly, a better educated population. And Michael, you touched on some key points of that, is that you have certain positives and attributes that you use to be an effective person. And that's what we need to focus on, is what are the pieces that somebody can do that makes them effective. And what I talked with my students about just yesterday is there used to be, if somebody would come into a employment application, and when we used to have paper applications, almost everybody, of course, is using online today, but a person in a wheelchair would roll into an office and say to the person at the front desk, "I'd like an employment application." And the person at the front desk would say, "Well, sir, you're in a wheelchair. We're not even going to give you an employment application because you're in a wheelchair." And the Americans with Disability Act, of course, interfered with that. It took a while for employers to figure that out. But to avoid that knee-jerk reaction that this person can't do the job, let's focus on what they can do. And when somebody gets hurt at work and can't do the job they could previously do, that doesn't mean you just dump them on the street. It means that you make reasonable accommodation and you try to see the best way to put that person to work. Do they have other skills? They may not be able to drive a truck or do certain mechanical things anymore, but are they capable of being a dispatcher or bookkeeping or sales calls? Is there someplace else that person can be valuable to your company?
One of my favorite speeches that I deliver is called Moving from Diversity to Inclusion. And it's actually mostly the second episode in Unstoppable Mindset. And one of the things that I talk about in there is how people deal with disabilities. And I actually play a segment from a television show called What Would You Do, that John Quinones on ABC does. And this particular episode had, well, the premise of the show was they get actors to play different roles. And they do it to see how people will react to uncomfortable situations. So they had, in this case, two women from the Rochester Institute for the Deaf. They were deaf. And they go into this coffee shop where there's a guy behind the counter who happened to be an actor, a barista, and there's a sign out that they're looking for employees. And so one of them goes up and says, "I want to apply for a job." And the guy goes, "Well, what can you do?" And she says, "Well, you have a kitchen job available here." And he says, "Yeah, but you can't do that. You're deaf." And by the way, this is only in the last 12 or 13 years. So it's way post ADA.
Yes.
And she says, "Well, but it's a kitchen job. I'm not really being out here. I would be in the kitchen." "Well, but what if I need something immediately?" And she said, "Well, you could write it down." "Well, I might not have the time to write it down. You're just not someone that I could hire." And the whole point is to see how people who overhear this react. And so part of the show, and they recorded all, of course, part of the show had 3 HR people come up to this barista, not knowing that he's just an actor, and say, "Look, you handled that all wrong. These people have more rights than we do." This is all recorded. "These people have more rights than we do. You should have just taken the application, written, not a fit, and filed it and sent them on their way.
Oh my goodness.
And some others really hit the roof about what this barista guy was doing. And of course they intercept everyone and tell them what's really going on somewhere on the line. But we really have still a very long way to go in terms of how we deal with so-called disabilities. And it's in part because of that show that I came up with this whole concept that in reality, we all have disabilities. Most of you are light dependent and we love you anyway. But, you know, the fact is that we shouldn't be judging what someone's abilities are or aren't. And it's so unfortunate that we do.
Well, this is you've raised an important example, and as I indicated, that is the classic that I try and untrain people from, if you will, to have that knee-jerk reaction. It's like, let's focus on what this person can do. And unfortunately, because of decades and decades of discrimination against people with disabilities, you have a very interesting situation out there where when a person has been accommodated and does get a position where the company has reached out and said, let's see how we can afford this person opportunity, a lot of times they tend to be great employees and tend to have be very loyal to the companies that are more accepting and inclusive. And so it's a win-win for the situation.
Sure. How did you get into education, college education and so on from law?
Well, I had decided that as I left law school, that about the 25-year marker, that I would move into education. It's just something I felt that was an appropriate, career path for me. So I did a, decade corporate and about 12 years in private practice full time. And then when my last kid left for college, I said, it's time for me to do something. And I had been adjuncting very actively. And what happened was I realized that even though I had a law degree and an MBA, I was very well qualified, that without a Ph.D., I would not be successful in competing for tenure. And if you're not a tenured professor, that's kind of the gold standard in higher ed. And so I went back to the University of Virginia where I'd got my MBA. And I worked on my PhD full time. It was quite an eye opener. And I know we're running out of time. I'll just say very quickly, the PhD program went very, very well for me. I did quite well. I finished the program a year ahead of my cohort because I was so focused and went year round and so forth. Managed to continue to work with my clients here in Houston to, at least keep the bills paid. But unfortunately, when I finished my PhD, it took me 2 years to get my first full-time appointment. And the discrimination that I faced as a person who got their PhD in the aged mid-50s, whereas the traditional, and this touches on classic discrimination, the traditional PhDs are in their mid-30s. So I was 20 years older than the normal, quotation marks, PhD recipient, and it's been a bit of a struggle. So I'm, very appreciative of the universities that did afford me a full-time teaching opportunity. And once I got into the track, I progressed from a visiting professor to a full professor to a tenured endowed chair. But I had to have that opportunity in the first place.
So in addition to all of that, you mentioned earlier that you like to write even when you were young. What's writing done for you in all of your experiences?
Well, you cannot get a PhD if you're not a writer. You cannot be a successful attorney without being a writer. And you cannot be an author unless you sit down and you write. And so one of the things the PhD did for me is it gave me the understanding of doing deep research and things like that. And that enabled me to write Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures, which was released by Post Hill Press on President's Day 2018. And then my newer book, A Bad Deal for America, was released on President's Day 2022. And I'm hoping not to have a 4-year gap between that and my next book, but I am working on, as we talked about briefly, on a musical review called Novel T, the letter T. And it is a musical review of novelty songs from the 50s through the 70s and 80s, when there were a variety of novelty songs that became hits on the radio. So, and that's a throwback to my days of doing the Arts Menagerie.
Flying Purple People Eater with Chef Willie, I would assume.
You are very good. That is definitely in the list. And I'll have to go back and look. I have one of my research assistants has been talking to the different publishing houses to make sure that we have the rights to present that. So the review focuses on the music. There's not a lot of text in between, but we actually, through doing podcasts to promote my current book, met a gentleman, Douglas Coleman, and Douglas has a podcasting show. And he has actually written a theme song for the new musical, and that's very close to being ready.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
That's the plan. It's designed to be family friendly.
It should be. That would be a good thing. Well, how do people get a hold of you, reach out to you, learn about you and your books and so on? Well, you've been an unstoppable guy. There's no question about that. You've done a lot of things. And you're driven. I'm still working on it, Michael. It's a work in progress. And my consulting firm is called Claremont Management Group. So World Wide Web, ClaremontManagementGroup.com. I am on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Getter, and I'm trying to remember some others, but I'm pretty easy to find. And of course, both of my books, Bad Deal for America and Decline of America, are on Amazon. So is there a specific email address or LinkedIn address or anything that people should look
It's D Schein, and about the only hard part is my last name is Schein. It's spelling, the EI is pronounced Ein from the German spelling. But other than that, if people can put in David D. Schein, and that'll probably pop up several places. I think Amazon has got enough market power that tends to pop up first.
Right. Well, David, thank you very much. This has been fun. And as I told you initially, and I say on the podcast, one of the reasons for doing this is to tell stories that will inspire people. And I've got one last question I've got to ask. What would you advise both for young people today and parents today, having grown up in a time when information wasn't so readily available or self-gratification wasn't so readily available? Now, both of those kinds of things have changed and everyone wants everything immediately. How would you advise people, kids and adults?
Well, I think it's extremely important to mirror what my parents did, which is that the focus of childhood should be on education and a solid 3 R's education. Even though I'm a business professor, I encourage STEM, and I'd like to see us get as many children motivated for science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, as possible in the United States, because we are trailing other countries. And I would encourage parents to be involved in their children's education, make sure that the children are getting a real education and not a bunch of political malarkey. Is let's focus on the 3 R's and let the students, when they get a little bit older, figure out how they want to move in life in terms of politics and, those kind of things. And everybody can get through college. Again, this student loan dismissal stuff clouds the fact that there are plenty of scholarship opportunities. There are financial loans out there. The school that I teach at, we have 92% of our undergraduates on financial aid. Many of that is grants. That doesn't mean loans. That means that's money they don't have to pay back. And so if students do well in high school and they perform well, there are opportunities for them. And again, I'm living proof that if you put in the time and you do it, it can be. I was successful as a corporate person and successful in private practice and successful in higher ed, but it came with putting in that time and having that good parental support at home at the critical period when I needed it.
Of course, if we're going to be totally technical, and this was even a Jeopardy question recently, out of the 3 R's, there's only one that's really an R, and that's the reading, because writing isn't an R, and arithmetic doesn't start with an R.
You are absolutely correct.
Aren't I difficult?
I wasn't a very good speller when I was in grammar school, and the nuns used to really take me to task. I think spelling used to be a separate grade when I was in grammar school with the nuns.
Yeah.
And I flunked several years in a row, and you say, well, let's get this straight. You were a young high school graduate. You graduated before you turned 18. How the heck did you get through flunking all those courses? And it was very straightforward. My mother was the secretary for the church operation down the street. And the nuns knew that Dave Schein sometimes flunked spelling and cursive writing, but he was a pretty smart kid, and his mom was right there with him. And so they passed me, probably 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. But what happened is when I got to that point where the light switch went on and I said, gosh, I can really do this, I had a very successful 7th and 8th grade, and then a very successful high school experience, because I did absorb that, even if I didn't show it on my report card.
And then you went on from there. Well, David Schein, thanks for being here. We really enjoyed it. And I hope it inspires parents and kids, and I hope it inspires people to reach out to you.
Well, I'm delighted to do it, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you, and my folks will work with your folks to see about having you make an appearance on Saving America.
Would love to do it. And for all of you, definitely go find David's Saving America podcast. And we hope that you enjoyed this. Please give us a 5-star rating. Wherever you're listening to the podcast, go and rate us. It's the way we are able to know what you think. And of course, we like good ratings. We like to hear whatever you have to say. And if you want to comment about this or any of our podcasts, feel free to email me at michaelhi, michaelhi @accessibe.com. And, or you can go to our podcast page, which is www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast, and check out whether it's there or anywhere you get podcasts. Go check us out and listen to some of the other episodes. And we hope that you'll join us again next time on Unstoppable Mindset. Thanks again for listening. And Dave, thanks for being here.
Thank you.